Good morning. Welcome to Sunday Morning Devotional, brought to you by Golden Isles Primitive Baptist Fellowship and Heart Floss TV. I'm Vernon Eckleberry, and this morning I have a lesson for you entitled From Sadness to Gladness, and it's taken from Matthew chapter 2. Jesus prepared his disciples for the time when he would no longer be with them, with the words, "Your sorrow shall be turned to joy," in John 16:20. And certainly their sorrow that they experienced when Jesus departed from them was soon turned to joy. And that's always the case with the people of God. But 33 years before that, there was no joy in Jerusalem. It looked like an ancient sorrow had once again invaded the land. There was no joy in Judea. All looked lost. And so we find in Matthew chapter 2 the account of the things that happened after Jesus was born. It begins, of course, with the fact that Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, and after that birth, sometime after the birth actually, wise men came from the east to Jerusalem, and there they inquired, where is this child that's born King of the Jews? Because they had seen his star in the east. Well, when old wicked King Herod heard this, it troubled him, and so he sent for his scribes and his priests and asked them, what is this thing that they are speaking of, and where should this Christ be born? And of course they had the scriptures, they had the prophecy of Micah, and they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea. Well, then Herod, when he heard that, devised a plan. And so he called the wise men back, and he inquired of them as to when the star had appeared. He was going to do some calculating as to how old this child might be. And then he sent the wise men to Bethlehem and asked them to find out where the child was, and then come back and tell him so he could worship him as well. And so the wise men went on their way. They came to Bethlehem, and they saw where the child was, and they rejoiced. And you know about the gifts that they gave to them, the gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. Well, what are they going to do about reporting back to Herod? An angel came to them in their sleep and told them that they are not to go back to Herod, but they are to go another way, back to their country another way, and that's what they did. Meanwhile, an angel appears to Joseph and says to him that he should arise and take the young child and the mother and flee into Egypt and stay there until I bring you word, because Herod is going to seek the young child to destroy him. Well, and that's of course what Joseph did. When Herod found out that he had been betrayed, he was very, very angry. And this is what he did. He sent forth, this is such a tragedy. He sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem and in all the coast, that is, all of the surrounding area, and thereof, and from 2 years old and under. And why 2 years old and under? Well, he had found out when the star appeared, that would have been when the child was born, and apparently it was somewhere just under 2 years. And so he had all the children 2 years old and under. He had them slain. And And then, of course, Matthew writes that this fulfilled something. Then, and this is in Matthew 2:17, then was fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremy, or Jeremiah, the prophet, saying, in Ramah there was heard a voice of lamentation and weeping, and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and would not be comforted because they are not, or they weren't there. And where does this come from? Well, let's look first of all at Rachel and Rachel's sorrow. You know, of course, that she was Jacob's beloved wife, and so we go back to Genesis chapter 35, and the family had not been doing well, and God came to them, and he told Jacob, you need to get back to Bethel. Get back to the basics. Get back to me, God was telling him. And so Jacob and the family, they rose up and they made their journey to Bethel. Now, along the way, after in their travels, a tragic thing happens. And this is recorded in Genesis 35:16. They journeyed from Bethel, and there was but a little way to come to Ephraim, and Rachel travailed, and she had hard labor. And it came to pass, when she was in hard labor, that the midwife said unto her, fear not, thou shalt have this son also. Now the other son that Rachel had given birth to was, of course, Joseph. And the other children were born to the other wife, her sister, Leah. And, of course, she didn't make it. We read in the following verse, and it came to pass as her soul was in departing, for she died, that she called his name, that is the name of the child, Benoni, but his father called him Benjamin. And Benoni in the Hebrew tongue was son of my sorrow. It was a sorrowful time. Now, her bitterness, her sorrow, her grieving wasn't directed at the boy, at the son, at Benjamin. Her grieving was because she would no longer see her children. She would be separated from them as she left them in death. And so we come now to Rachel's sepulcher. We read that in the next verses in this 35th chapter of Genesis. Rachel died and was buried in the way to Ephraim, which is Bethlehem. So it's important to remember the proximity of Rachel's grave or sepulcher to Bethlehem, the place where Jesus was born. So Rachel died and was buried in the way to Ephraim, which is Bethlehem, and Jacob set a pillar upon her grave, that is the pillar of Rachel's grave unto this day. So the place is somewhere north of Bethlehem, and the site became an important landmark in Jewish history. As a matter of fact, when Samuel anointed Saul to be the first king of Israel, he told him, when thou art departed from me today, then thou shalt find 2 men by Rachel's sepulcher in the border of Benjamin and Zelzah. That's in 1 Samuel 10:2. So the site, the grave, was well known to the Jews in that day. The sepulcher site was known to all of the people in ancient Israel, and for all, Rachel had a special significance. So let's go on now then to Rachel's significance. Rachel's sorrow upon dying and seeing her children no more, became a symbol for all of the ills that would befall the children of Israel. Of their Babylonian captivity, Jeremiah wrote, and we'll go to Jeremiah 31:15, of their impending captivity when the children of Israel were being carried away into Babylon. Of that, Jeremiah writes in Jeremiah 31:15, "Thus saith the Lord, a voice was heard in Ramah." Now, Ramah was the place that the Jews were taken and from there deported into Babylon. So that's why the voice is heard from Ramah, where the atrocity was taking place. "Thus saith the Lord, a voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping." And whose voice was that? Well, figuratively, it was Rachel. Rachel weeping for her children. And that would be all the children you see going into exile at this time. Rachel weeping for her children, refused to be comforted for her children because they were not. They were being carried away and separated from their homeland. So you see the significance here is that as with the sadness of her separation from her own children, her weeping voice is said to cry out for the children of Israel because they were not. They were no longer home and they were separated, of course. Ramah was the place where the captives were held. And terrible things happened. They were held in chains. Many were put to death who were too old or too ill to make the arduous journey to Babylon. And above this atrocity, Rachel's voice figuratively laments and weeps for the children, for the captives, because they were not. So that's the significance then of our Matthew reading in 2:17, where Matthew writes that when these children were slain by this evil king, Matthew writes, "Then was fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, In Ramah was there a voice heard, lamentation and weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and would not be comforted because they are not." So beyond the captivities and the weeping voice of Rachel, which seemed to overshadow all of that, Jeremiah was looking forward to this atrocious event. And once again, Rachel is in mourning for her children because they are not. So this is the tragedy. And that's the significance of Rachel's weeping, her voice, and not being comforted. Because again, the Jews were experiencing a terrible thing. But now we go on to Rachel's satisfaction. God tells Jeremiah in this same prophecy that we were speaking of, God tells Jeremiah, in context with that, "My people shall be satisfied with my goodness, saith the Lord." This terrible thing is going to happen. There's going to be this cry of Rachel ascending from the place where they were held in Ramah. But that's not the end of it. Jeremiah says that God has said, "My people shall be satisfied with my goodness, saith the Lord." In other words, better days are coming. And certainly it was the case for the Israelites, for the Jews, because they would return from Babylon. Now, back to our second chapter of Matthew, and the events surrounding the death of the children and Herod and Joseph and the family in Egypt, that too was going to turn for the better. You see, Herod would die. Verse 19 says, but when Herod was dead, and then what happened when he died? Well, the child Jesus was going then to return back to the land. But when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in Egypt, saying, arise and take the young child and his mother, and go into the land of Israel, for they are dead, which sought the young child's life. So what did Joseph do? He arose and took the young child and his mother and came to the land of Israel. So the child returned. And in this child Jesus, the Son of God, in this child returns all the martyrs, all the children, all the fallen Jews, and of this great hope, Jeremiah writes these glorious words, refrain thy voice from weeping and thine eyes from tears, for thy work shall be rewarded, saith the Lord. In other words, it'll come to a good end. And that's what he writes, and they shall come again from the land of the enemy. They'll return, and there is hope in thy end, saith the Lord, that thy children shall come again to their own border. The captives would return. The exiled Jesus would return. And hope would return. That satisfaction would at last be theirs. Rachel needs weep no more. Rachel is comforted at last from sadness to gladness. And the great hope that we celebrate at Christmas is that we too need to weep no more. Jesus turns all of our sadness to gladness. And that's why we sing each Christmas, oh, tidings of comfort and joy. Comfort and joy. Oh, tiding of comfort and joy. And now may the Lord be with you till we meet again.